This wonderful snowy day. We already anticipate some fun stuff to play in. It'll be a good time, I think. But then again, I'm kind of a kid. Maybe I'm just the youngin'. I don't know. All right. So today we're going to be looking at a section of scripture. Let me grab my Bible here. You might need that. We're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 18, verses 1 through 12. We're going to look at I put on here a joyful reunion. It should probably be a joyful reunions, plural, because there are many such reunions. So Exodus chapter 18. Get that out there. Let me go ahead and read, and we will get down to. I want to read over the whole passage first. First 12 verses. Of course, this kind of cuts us in the middle of this section, but really, knowing how things progress in our class, it's probably not unwarranted to just take the first half of it, right? So we tend to be, long-winded, I guess. But it says this: Exodus 18, verses 1 through 12. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, along with her 2 sons. The name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. The name of the other was Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And when he sent words to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because of this affair that they dealt arrogantly with the people. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat the bread of Moses' father-in-law before God. All right. Well, we see here a number of reunions and some interesting family dynamics that take place here, and interesting things that are said here. Now, a lot of this is just sort of introductory material to set up a couple of what's going to happen a little bit later in the narrative. But it's important thing. These are important things to remember. So, am I in your way here? I can scoot to the side. There we go. I can still stay under that thing, I guess. All right. So the first person that we meet, the very first word in the sentence in verse 1, is Jethro. It just needs to hover over that arrow. Go ahead and click it. Yeah. Go ahead and click it to the next. Okay, I got it. Unless my batteries are dead. Go ahead and click it to the next slide and we'll see. Okay, there we go. Nope.
Just say click or something. I can sit back here.
Hey, I did have some batteries in here. Maybe I don't.
Double or triple A?
Triple A.
Well, I definitely don't have those.
So my wife this week cleaned out the junk drawers. We have 2, and found a multitude of batteries in the junk drawers. And it was my job to go through and see which ones were good and which ones were not. So I did, and we have a number of good batteries. So that was pretty cool. All right, let's see. What's that? Are we on? Now we're on. Is it plugged in? No, it's still dead. Okay.
That's fine. I'll sit back there.
Okay. So
Look at me funny or something.
okay. So yeah, right. So we have Jethro. So the first person that's mentioned. Go ahead and click it.
Yeah, that's.
Not this Jethro. Okay.
See, now why is it? Now, I mean, I'm glad that I figured out a long time ago that Jethro and Jedediah were good, strong biblical names.
Yeah.
Jethro, Nimrod. I mean, Jethro was a great leader. Nimrod was a great hunter. And now you think Jethro, you think
This guy. Yeah.
Nimrod, you think
Yeah. Sure. So but we're not talking about this Jethro, right? Good click. We're also not talking about that Jethro. But which Jethro are we talking about here? Go ahead and click. Jethro. Yes, thank you. Now, the first thing that we see Jethro mentioned as is the priest of Midian. Go ahead and click. I think it's the next one. Yeah, so he's described as the priest of Midian. Now, this is an interesting moniker for him because what we see at the end of this section, right? We see him offering sacrifices before God, and he is there with Moses. So, if we take it into consideration along with the context is God has just exercised judgment upon the gods of Egypt. And so these pagan gods, God has shown himself to be powerful over them. And at the end of this section, Jethro, the priest of Midian, is going to offer sacrifices to the God of Moses, to Yahweh, to the Lord. So the priest of Midian, Jethro, he's not an Israelite. Do you remember who the Midianites were? The Midianites were a group of people who descended from Abraham. After Sarah died, he remarried a woman named Keturah. And Midian was a child of Abraham and Keturah later on in Abraham's life. And the Midianites came from him. So they are distantly related, but they're not the child of the promise. The Midianites did not go through Aaron. So we're not talking about the Israelites here. And yet we have an example in the Old Testament here of a Midianite, someone who is outside of the covenant people of God, who nevertheless knew something about God. He was a priest to the one true God. And even in this Old Testament context, this pre-Israelite or pre-people of Israel context, the pre-covenant, I should say, context, the Midianites somehow, the story of God continued on down through that line. Now, they did not obviously occupy Jerusalem. They did not worship at the temple. But nevertheless, they did worship and acknowledge Yahweh at this point in history anyway. All right, go ahead and go to the next. Moses' father-in-law, he's called. He's called Moses' father-in-law, I don't know, a dozen times in the 12 verses that we looked at. Kind of get tired of saying father-in-law, father-in-law, father-in-law. That's what he's known for. That is his relationship to Moses. That relationship is accentuated. Now, as we get to the remainder of the narrative, it is a rather interesting thing because Jethro is going to advise Moses on some policy of how to handle leadership and things like that a little bit later on. That's well and good. But the interesting thing about that, and I don't want to steal thunder from next week, but Jethro doesn't command Moses in the sense that he exercises a parental authority over him, but he does suggest him, and Moses takes that into consideration. And so this relationship of father-in-law to Moses, it's an interesting dynamic. It shows us the idea of leaving and cleaving. Remember, who was it that took Moses in when he was alone in the desert? It was Jethro. He had lived for 40 years under Jethro's house. He, in all likelihood, would have submitted to him as father at some point or stage in his life, maybe, at least before he was married to his daughter, Zipporah. But what we see here is this idea of this relationship between he and Moses, where it's almost one of a peer relationship, even though we see Moses honoring as we will continue through the narrative, we see Moses honoring Jethro, and I think that's appropriate. That's appropriate. We should. There's certainly when we leave our homes and when our children leave our home, they have a certain level of responsibility that puts them in charge of their lives. And yet, we as parents, or our parents, still have the ability to speak wisdom into our lives. Moses is 80 years old at this point. He's older than anybody in this room, maybe. I don't know. I'm not going to ask ages. He is 80 years old, and yet he still has that respect for his father-in-law. No. Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know. We have no idea. We have no idea. We know that he's probably at least 80 because, Moses is married to his daughter, right? So they have to be, and they got married 40 years ago. So Moses at least maybe 60, somewhere in there. I don't know. So they're who knows? Who knows if he may be younger, he may be older. I'm guessing if, Moses at 40 married Zipporah at 20, who knows? Nobody knows. Although we do know that it was rather infrequent that women remained unmarried for long. So there was probably a pretty big age disparity there. All right, so anyway.
This is kind of off the subject. Who was it that objected to marrying her because of the race thing?
That's later on, and that may have been Zipporah. It may have been also a different wife. I think it was a different wife, was it not? Because she was a Cushite, I think. So that would have been after Zipporah passed away, and Aaron and Miriam. I was thinking Midian, and my brain was stuck there, like a broken record. No, it was Miriam. Aaron and Miriam. They objected, and of course God straightened them out. So he's like, "Oh, Miriam, you like to be white, hey? White you are, with leprosy." And yeah, because Cushites are African, right? So that would have been even by today's standards, we would have looked at that and called it an interracial marriage, quote unquote. Obviously God did not object to that because Moses' wife was evidently a follower of Yahweh. So there was no religious issues going on there, and why not? And I think you talked about that last week when we were looking in that section, paragraph 3 of the 1689. But yeah, that's good. Anyway, so he is Moses' father-in-law, and that is what is stressed in this section, which probably gives us, and I would imagine one reason that the author would do that is so that people might understand. Okay, this is someone who has the authority to speak into the life of Moses, and because he's going to tell him what to do here in a little bit, at least advise him, and this guy does have authority to speak into his life. All right, so the next thing that we see, though, is that Jethro has been caring for Moses' family. And here's another interesting dynamic. If you'll look through here, we can see it on the passage that's on the screen there. It says, Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people. How the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home. The Bible calls Zipporah Moses' wife, not Jethro's daughter. Notice also that when we get down into the text, into the narrative here, let's see here, it talks about, it says, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down to him and kissed him. They asked each other about their welfare and went into the tent. Then Moses' father-in-law, Moses told him everything. Let's see. Oh, here it is, verse 6. Sorry, I was reading down too low. It says, when he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her two sons with her. I'm not coming with my daughter. I'm coming with your wife. So it's not just that the text, talks about her as the wife of Moses as opposed to the daughter of Jethro. Jethro himself speaks of her that way as well. When we do a wedding, it's traditional for the father of the bride to walk the bride down the aisle and give her away to the husband, right, the groom. And we don't, that's sort of a tradition that we've always had. But do we ever take time to reflect upon the meaning of that? Because that is the only part of the weddings of our current wedding ceremony that was ever seen in Scripture when God instituted marriage. When did God institute marriage? God instituted marriage when He brought His daughter Eve to be wed to Adam, her husband. And it says that God brought Eve to Adam, and they were married. That is the sum total of the wedding ceremony that we see in the Genesis narrative. The father bringing the daughter to and when we do that in a wedding ceremony, I'm not saying that none of it else of it has validity. It certainly does. But when we do that in a wedding ceremony, we are recapitulating the most ancient of traditions. It goes all the way back to creation itself. But there is a real transference of headship that takes place in that moment. Does that mean that Jethro is no longer the father of Zipporah? Well, by no means. He certainly is. But that relationship takes a back seat to the primary relationship of husband and wife. There is a leaving and cleaving on both ends. God describes marriage, the narrative through the narrative of Genesis, when He says that for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and he shall cleave to his wife. They will become one flesh. Okay, so that is a real thing that happens, and we see that reflected right here, just sort of in the assumption of this narrative. But at the same time, go ahead and click it. At the same time, what's that? Oh, no, it doesn't even have the laser thing on. So I'll just get some more batteries. Yeah, it's just dead. So he is caring for the children and the wife.
How long had it been
Well,
since Moses had sent her back to her?
we're not told that, but we do see in Genesis 2 and 3. In chapter 2, we see the birth of Gershom, which is the older of the two, right? And in Genesis 4, I believe it is, where we see Moses. Exodus. Sorry, my brain is not having a good time making transitions today. Yeah. In Genesis 4, in Exodus 4, we see this account of Zipporah and Moses on their way to Egypt. And this is the account, if you remember, that he has not yet circumcised his son. And God comes along to kill Moses. And Zipporah rescues her husband by circumcising her son. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, because there's a lot in that text that is just like, but we see that happened on the way into the Exodus. Now, how long did it take? How long did it take for God to deliver the people? Maybe a few months. But at some point, we're not told when. At some point, Moses sends his wife back to Midian to dwell with her father, probably because she was pregnant. Who knows? Because now we have a second child that doesn't get named until after Moses gets delivered. Interesting dynamic there as well. So Zipporah evidently is in Midian while Moses is walking through the Red Sea. And he comes back, and all of a sudden Zipporah has a child that gets named. And what's his name? Eleazar. And why is he named Eleazar? Because the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. When had God delivered Moses from the sword of Pharaoh? Yeah, was Zipporah with him? No. She had been sent back, and she had not had the child. Yeah, she was sent back into Midian, probably to dwell with her parents, so that, once it was discovered that she was pregnant, probably Moses was like, yeah, this is not the place I want you to be. Which to this tells us a whole lot more about the family dynamic, if what we're saying is true. So at some point, Moses had sent Zipporah back. Why would he do that? Exactly. Because who knows what Pharaoh can do? Pharaoh's an unhinged maniac. He's willing to sacrifice his own people and their well-being and the country's economy just to satisfy his pride. And probably when it was found out that Zipporah was pregnant, he said, maybe you should just go stay with your dad. Take Gershom with you.
Where did they go?
To Midian, evidently. Yeah, that's where Jethro was. So at least that's what we're assuming.
That's where Moses had lived for 4 years.
Yes. Yeah, wherever that was, and it was probably a thing where he was, dwelling in because he had herds and things and flocks, and he would probably be dwelling in a semi-nomadic fashion. But he says, the God of my father was my help. Oh, wait a second. Let's go. Gershom was named before the Exodus. Gershom was the child that he had before the Exodus because he had been a sojourner in a foreign land. Remember, Moses came out of Egypt 40 years prior to the Exodus. And that's why he named Gershom what he did. And then the second child, you go ahead and click on the next things there. Sorry, I forget to do that. Gershom sounds like, go ahead and click another one. Sounds like sojourner. Eleazar sounds like God is my help. And so Gershom is the child born before the Exodus. Eleazar is born after the Exodus. But he most likely sent her back to be cared for by her father so that no harm would befall her. What does that tell us about family dynamics even now? Well, it tells us that fathers-in-law or in-laws and grandparents have a significant role to play in the family dynamic. That sort of is I think we're all grandparents here, I believe. So we all have grandchildren. We know that there is a way that if our children who are parents up to our grandchildren, if our children need help with their kids, how many times have you taken care of their children? Ongoing, right? It happens all the time. Well, God gave us grandparents, and that is a ministry. It's one that I think is often overlooked, but certainly God gave us a role to play in the continued parenting of our adult children. That can be somewhat more difficult, I think, than when they're children.
They have their own homes, they have their own
Yep.
lives, they have their own kids.
Yep.
But I think for the most part, it's
Yeah.
still come to us for help and advice.
Praise God. That's good. And that's the way it should be. And we should take that seriously. It is indicative of our culture to have this sort of desire for the empty nest. And we talk about, you see that happening all the time. I remember seeing that, YouTube and things like that. Nobody there, parents can go do what they've always wanted to do. They're free to do this and free to do that. Yeah, no, it doesn't happen. And I mean, only when it's curated for Instagram or something like that, or, oh yeah. Yeah, we still got those.
You're not ancestors.
That's true. Not yet. Yeah, buddy. Well, so, but you see, that is the ideal, and you see people cutting off having children after 35 or 40, so that they can have an empty nest, and still enjoy their life, by themselves and this sort of thing. That should not be our goal. The goal should be multi-generational faithfulness, and that's going to require you to minister as a parent to your child and a grandparent to your grandchildren, and God willing, if you bless us with great grandchildren, until the day you die. That's going to be my job until the day I die, and that's the kind of mentality we should inspire in our children, even when they're children. Show them that there are generations who have gone before them who have been faithful, who can give good advice, who can offer wisdom. Now, granted, they'll have to weigh that themselves and figure out what to do. But yeah, that is we ought to be preparing ourselves for that stage of life, and not seeing it as, oh, I'm just going to go spoil my grandkids. Why would you want to do that to why would you want to cut off your progeny? Because that's what's going to happen. You realize that if your grandchildren don't have any discipline, they're going to be destroyed. If they don't have any wisdom, they're going to be destroyed. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, says God. If we do not pass on the knowledge of God to generations, it can die in our family. Who wants that? Why would we ever want that? Why would we want to see our children cursed like that? Yes, let us recapture a vision of multi-generational faithfulness as grandparents and as great-grandparents as we move into that phase of our life. Well, Jethro certainly is there to help Moses and Zipporah and the grandkids, but he's happy to be reunited now with Moses. Give those kids back. Amen. Yes.
But Moses was raised in the prince.
Yeah.
So he wanted to learn a different. When he left, he knew
Yeah.
he had to serve God.
Yes.
So when he.
That's a great point. Go ahead.
So then he wanted to know how to do this.
Yeah.
So therefore, that's why he ended up doing what he did, because God was guiding him the whole way
Well, sure.
and talking to him
Yeah.
like he does people. And God says that after the children get older and they become on their own, they belong to him. So evidently this was not taught back then.
Well, I think it was more or less assumed, I would think.
Yeah, I think
But it was
so.
certainly revealed for an example for us.
Right,
You know?
yes. And if we're the good example as far as being the parent, then when our kids get older, they don't let us tell them what to do.
No, they won't let it, and they certainly,
They don't.
yeah.
They
Well,
don't.
and that's not our job.
No.
Moses
But
doesn't
to
let Jethro,
advise them in the will of God, now, that's
Yeah.
a different thing.
and that's what Jethro does, as we'll see.
And that's
Absolutely.
what I do.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's when we talk about multi-generational faithfulness, we're not talking about holding on to authority over our children. No. When they leave the home, it is for this reason, God says. He's talking about marriage.
Yes.
For this reason that a man will leave his father and mother. So there is a leaving that takes place. There is not in the sense that, yeah, fine, we're gone, we're out of here, we'll never talk to you again. That's not what it's talking about. It's saying, though, that the primary relationship when you get married is your spouse, and that holds true for our children as well. Yes, they're going to love mom and dad. Hopefully that'll continue on. They're going to respect our wisdom and that sort of thing. But their primary relationship and responsibility is to their spouse. And if I were to, let's say, Jordan and Rachel get married, and they go along, and all of a sudden I went over to their house and I said, no, Rachel, you need to tell Jordan to do this, and you need to tell him to do that, and you can't do this, and you can't do it. At that point, he is her head, right? She is to listen to him unless he tells her to sin. She is to follow his direction, not mine. If they conflict, which I don't know, I don't ever see that happening.
She'll set you straight on that.
And I wouldn't go to Rachel anyway, so I could talk to Jordan. So because I know who the federal head of the family is, and it would be him at that point. And yeah.
You would have the conversation with me the following Monday if he did something like that. My response would be, "You did what?"
Right.
And you had one ready too.
Well, exactly.
She listens to Jeremy. She doesn't take orders.
And if there's an issue, you go to Jeremy.
Yep.
Yeah, and I know that. And I don't know if there's been any issues, but it's also kind of cool that I see Jeremy's degree of respect for you as I see your guys' interaction, not only in person but on social media and stuff like that. As I'm able to see that.
There's been a situation, Rose and I were talking about something. It's like, well, I said, well, I think this might be a decent idea. She said, well, Jeremy's doing this. And I said, well, then follow your husband.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
was the end of it.
That's it. Absolutely.
Even if you go to the husband, they need to consult with each other.
Well, yes, but the husband is the head of the home, and if he decides that
As
there's
far
going to
as
be,
you talking to him.
Sure.
They need to take it on
Both take a part in what?
the issue.
Possibly. It may be. Or it may be something that he just needs to decide for the family on his own, which is his prerogative. So that is the case too. But a good husband does not ignore his wife. You know, that would be foolish. Because why would you? God gave you that woman as your helper, your complement, your completion. Why would you ignore that resource?
Not to mention happy wife, happy life.
Yeah, well, I'm not mentioning that actually, because there's sometimes we need to make our wives unhappy, quite frankly, and it needs to happen. And that doesn't make us happy, but it might help make us holy. So, but anyway, we're kind of far afield here, but we do see what. I mean, I'll take that up if anybody wants to argue that. Anyway, so we have Jethro. He's the father-in-law. He comes. He's been caring for the family. He comes now and says, "Here, now that we're out of harm's way," and I think as a man, he recognizes, okay, my job here is done. Let me turn the responsibility back over to its rightful person here, and he does so. Go ahead and we're on the next one. Okay. And then so Jethro comes and he rejoices. He rejoices with Moses. And this is in verse 10, but I do want to back up for a second here. It says Moses told his father-in-law all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced in the good that the Lord had done to Israel, in that he delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. Just take notice real quick here for a second. Again, this is a family dynamic. We are commanded, Psalm 78, Deuteronomy 6, these are a couple of passages in which we are commanded to tell of the works and the law of God to the next generation, to our family members. Now, Jethro is not the next generation, but Moses is here declaring the good works of God, what God has done. And obviously, Jethro has a professional interest in this as well. He's a priest of Midian, so he's a priest of Yahweh in Midian. So to hear what the Lord has done is wonderful news for him, and it enables him to minister better. We have the scriptures, and we read these and we talk over them with our children. Understand that these people were living the scriptures. They didn't have as much written down, and at this point, they didn't have, as far as we know, anything really written down. But he's beginning, and he's telling them of the great works of God. That becomes a family heritage for Moses and the Israelites. That's what a little bit later on Moses is going to be commanded to do as he's observing these feasts and this sort of thing. To teach your children to when you rise, when you lie down, when you walk along the way. We are to tell of the law of God. We are to tell of the works of God to our children, so that the next generation would not be as stubborn-headed as we are. Amen. I mean, that's my summary statement of Psalm 78. So that they would not forget God and forget His works. But we see Moses doing this, and Jethro responds and he blesses. It says that he blesses the Lord, who has blessed the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. He praises God for what God has done. And so the story begins from one mouth to another. We tell of the wonderful works of God, and God, and Moses does this with Jethro and blesses him, and Jethro in turn blesses God. He says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. What was God doing in Israel when he was pouring out the plagues upon what was he doing in Egypt when he was pouring out the plagues upon Egypt?
Showing his superiority over
the gods, the small g gods. Absolutely. He was passing judgment on them, and he was showing that no one has the power to stop his hand.
He was doing exactly what Jethro recognized in verse 11.
Absolutely. And that was the point. Jethro got the point.
Yeah.
And that will be the point later on, as we'll see, like 40 years later, when they're crossing over into Jericho and they send the spies to Rahab, and Rahab says, 40 years ago, and she repeats what happened.
It's still happening.
Well, sure, God is conquering his enemies.
Yeah.
Absolutely, he's showing his superiority over the gods of this world. So anyway, this this is Jethro realizes what the whole point was. God is great. The Lord Yahweh is greater than all gods, small g gods, all those who would pretend to be God. Because
Demons of this world.
yeah, that's exactly what they are when it comes down to it. And then in verse 12 it says Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And then in comes Aaron with all the elders of Israel to eat the bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So this is this phrase, before God. You mentioned Nimrod earlier. Nimrod was a mighty warrior or mighty hunter before God, right? This phrase, before God, is sort of a worshipful thing. What are you doing before God? Because you're doing that in the presence of God, is essentially what it's alluding to here. And here we have, this is sort of prefiguring, at this point in history anyway, of the fellowship offerings that they will bring that people will bring to the temple. It's the Thanksgiving offering, or this is not an offering to atone for sin. This is an offering to give great thanks to God for what He has done. And you would sit down, and the priest would eat that before God, before the temple, in the presence of God. And so it's sort of a prefiguring of that. But what we see here notice the people who are included. We have Moses, obviously. We have Jethro, who's offering the sacrifice. And then we have Aaron. Aaron is the high priest, or he will be in a few chapters. Aaron essentially is the mouthpiece of Moses. And when Moses, when that whole charge was being given, God says, He says, you will be like God to Aaron, and he will be like a prophet. And so Aaron has already been used significantly in this time in history. But we see now that he is that he is dining with Moses, with his family. And then it says the elders of Israel. Now, we don't know how many people are gathered here exactly. Maybe it's one elder from every tribe. Maybe there's sub-tribe, some of the tribes within tribes. Maybe there's some of those as well. But perhaps this is what gives Jethro the idea that he's going to have in the next section. But these guys are recognized now as leaders in Israel. So yeah. All right. Any questions or comments? I might be able to answer in the fleeting moments together. The
Well,
last few fleeting
obviously,
moments.
that some of us don't have that relationship with in-laws, friends.
Sure.
You are on your own and with God in church.
That happens. But in what we saw earlier, what Karen alluded to earlier anyway, was the notion that here Moses, he was raised in Pharaoh's household. Now, he was raised at first by his mother was a wet nurse. It's really his mother. And supposedly she, by the time he was weaned, would have been at least teaching him. He would have been, 2, 3, 4 years old at the most, and then was taken to be raised among the Egyptians. So for all practical purposes, the court of Egypt was his home. And his, and Hatshepsut was his mother, or whoever it was, the princess of Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh likely would have been like a brother to him, and yet there's something that comes between kinship, and that should. Our first allegiance needs to be toward God, and Moses recognized that in sort of a weird, convoluted way, but eventually he comes to recognize that.
When he got older, like I did.
Well, he got older, but then he recognized an affinity with his people, and then he killed an Egyptian, which made him flee. But then he recognized, so it was kind of weird the way he kind of roundabout came to it, after 80 years. But nonetheless, Moses, he did finally recognize
so
it.
was fear that he left because of the killing. So, and it was all in God's divine plan.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was in God's